Alrighty, let's go ahead and start off with creating a style sheet. So in my styles, I'm going to create a new file, and we will take a look at loading less here as well. We'll probably do that when we bring Webpack into our example, our modules example template application. But for now, we're going to worry about just a normal CSS file because there's quite enough to talk about when we're just talking about CSS. So I'm going to say site.css. And let's do body background is a light gray, and our color is a darker gray. And I don't know. Let's do a an element called container. No, not container. Let's do an element called application with an ID of application. Give it a width of 500 pixels and a margin of auto. And then what I'm going to do is in public, I'm going to jump over into index.html. And I'm going to go ahead and create an element with the ID of application, and then inside of it, I'll add in a p tag with some lorem ipsum. So just a really straightforward thing. So now our point is, what we want to be able to do is we want to load this site.css into our index.html, but we are going to be using Webpack to do it. We're not going to be bringing in a external compilation step, nor are we going to bring in a copy step, nor are we going to actually load this in our head like we would normally do. So how do we do that? Well, if we hop back over into our scripts, let's say I wanted to import that CSS in here. Well, at this point, we're not going to be able to. So if I said var CSS equals require /styles site.css, let's just go ahead and see what happens if I try to do that. I'm going to restart our watch task here. And we get an error. It says unexpected token greater than. And that's because what it's trying to do is Webpack is trying to interpret this as a straight up JavaScript file. And that is not really what we want it to do. So what we need is we need a loader. A loader in Webpack is simply a thing, a plugin for Webpack. Well, I'm not going to call it a plugin from this point forward because plugins are different, but in essence, it's a plugin to Webpack that allows us to load different kinds of files. It allows us to kind of configure how things are loaded. Loaders can be used for transforms, like if we wanted to load in something with Babel or CoffeeScript. Loaders can be used for completely different types of resources, like CSS files or images. So they're very, very, very powerful and are very fundamental to working with Webpack. Now, the loader that we want does not come built into Webpack. So let's hop over back here and let's go ahead and install the one we want. I'm going to npm install CSS loader, and then I'm not going to worry about saving it because we don't have a package JSON anyway. So the CSS loader is, not surprisingly, a loader for CSS. Usually the loaders are pretty straightforward in what they do as far as their name goes. So let's go ahead and give this guy a moment here. And we have it. So yeah, that's quite a bit of CSS it has there. So let's go ahead and load Webpack again. Now you notice I'm opening up the watch task. We still get the error. So this is a really important thing to understand. Loaders don't just magically start working with Webpack. Webpack is a very configuration-oriented system. We're always going to have to tell Webpack about the loaders. And there's two ways in which we can tell Webpack about the loaders. The first way is within the require statement itself. I can go ahead and say require CSS and then an exclamation point. Now you'll notice that it did indeed load in. So right here, I'm specifying the loader name, which you can omit. You can do CSS loader, which is the package name, or you could do a shorthand by removing the dash loader. Generally, I don't do the dash loader. So we're doing CSS exclamation point, and that's saying, hey, Webpack, go out and load up the CSS loader and have him deal with it, and then have him return me whatever gets returned. And so here I can say console log CSS. And if I go ahead and I open up my public build app.js, you'll see down here that our CSS was indeed loaded. In fact, it was loaded and it's exporting itself, right? So if I come over here into my web browser and hit refresh, notice how what I get back is my CSS as an array. Now, obviously that's not particularly useful. Generally speaking, you're not going to want to load your CSS directly into your JavaScript. You want it to be added to the page itself. That's typically what you want to have happen. So to do that, we're going to use a different loader. Well, in a different loader in addition to our CSS loader that actually takes our styles and puts them into the web page itself. And so that's going to be, not surprisingly, called npm install style loader. So remember, the CSS loader is responsible for parsing the CSS, establishing if the CSS needs to load anything else. Now that's a really, really important note there, because the CSS loader will try to load in things that you import, such as images or fonts, and then it just returns it. But we want to add it to the page, and we do that with the style loader. So I'm going to say style exclamation point. So the first thing we do, so it reads right to left. Okay, which I don't know if I'm a big fan of that, but that's just how it works. The first thing we do is we use the CSS loader to load this file, and then we use the style loader to load whatever was returned by CSS. So now I can come over here and relaunch my Webpack, come over here and hit refresh, and check that out. Two things to notice. First of all, our CSS was indeed loaded. So the CSS load, or the style loader, did actually load up our CSS onto the page. Second thing to notice, that the exports that are returned by the style loader is just an empty object. Not very useful. It's not going to return back to us our CSS. But then again, parsing CSS in JavaScript would be a silly thing to do in most circumstances. That being said, if you really did just want to read the CSS, there's nothing stopping you from just importing that directly. But if you want it on the page, you're going to have to pass it in to the style loader. However, this is going to get really cumbersome. Generally speaking, you can identify what loaders you want your modules to use based off of the file name, especially if you have a module that gets included multiple times and has this custom loader configuration. You're not going to want to have to do that every single time you require in the file. You're going to want to tell Webpack that, okay, if you see this specific file, or if you see a file that matches this pattern, I want you to automatically go ahead and use these loaders. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and remove this and hit Control S. And remember, we get an error because it's trying to read in the CSS file as if it were JavaScript. I'm going to close down the watch task because we're going to be modifying our config. And then I'm going to jump into the config. Okay, to work with this config, we open up the modules object. Now, the modules object is a top-level property, so it's very, very important. Webpack is not going to complain if you put in bogus properties and bogus configuration options. It's not going to complain unless you accidentally, typed in a property it recognizes. If it sees a property it doesn't recognize, it's not going to throw an error. This is important because sometimes this config file can get really long and you'll forget where you are in it. And then you'll type in this configuration and it won't work because you didn't put it in the right place. So make sure that your modules object is located at the root of your config object. And then I'm simply going to do loaders. Now, loaders is an array, and it accepts objects. Now, there are different syntaxes you can do specifying loaders. I'm just going to look at one of them, and that is when you're going to open up an object, and you're going to pass in, first of all, the most important property of this object, which is called test. Now, test is going to be a regular expression, and the regular expression is going to tell Webpack when to use the loaders that we're about to specify. So in this case, the test is going to be \period, for a literal period. If you didn't escape it, of course, that would match anything. \period .css. Or, well, rather, \period CSS. And then I'm going to specify a second property here. It's going to simply be loader. And I'm going to pass in, not surprisingly, style exclamation point CSS. So I'm kind of putting that thing that I had on there already, but I'm putting it in the config file. And it's going to match for all CSS files, not just where I had that included. So now let's hop over here and let's run our Webpack task. And we still get an error because I accidentally did something that I warned you guys about. This configuration property is not called module, it's called module. Sorry about that. So again, when you work with this configuration and you see things not working the way you expect it to, first thing to look at is to open up the documentation page and actually read to make sure that you're using the correct names. I mean, that applies to everything, but it especially applies to monstrous configuration files, which this will typically turn into at some point. Anyway, let's go ahead and run this again, and we see it got built. So yeah, that's how we can go ahead and use our configuration to not have to repeatedly specify our loaders. Now, we'll look at other loaders. We'll look at one more in this video, at the very least. And when we import this into our modules example, we'll look at a couple more for things like loading in images. Like, let's say our CSS file loaded in an image or a font. We're going to want to have to deal with that as well. But we do that with the addition of loaders. Most things in Webpack are accomplished by adding a loader, basically. Now, what if you have a JavaScript file that is misbehaved and is not written in a module format? So what if I came over here to scripts and I wrote a new file and I called this test-bad.js? And this is just maybe a legacy JavaScript file that you pulled down off of Gulp or not NPM, because all of NPM is CommonJS, obviously. But you pulled it down from Bower or somewhere like that. It's just a misbehaving, badly formed JavaScript file. So what would you do? Let's say we have a test bad and a function do something. And let's say did something with jQuery. Did something like bought HTML or something like PO append to body. Okay. So let's say I really, really like this module, and I don't want to have to deal with converting it to or to CommonJS. Now, of course, to convert this to CommonJS, we would just do exports dot, and then we would say var money equals require jQuery. But let's say we don't have that luxury to be able to do that here. How would we work with this? Well, there's an awesome page that I highly recommend you guys have on hand at all times when working with legacy projects or legacy modules, and that is this right here. So it's under the Webpack doc wiki shimming modules, and this documentation goes through all the different ways that you might have a misbehaving module and how to fix it. But let's go ahead and see how we can do that right here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and kill Webpack for a second, and I'm going to npm install jQuery. So we will be loading jQuery through npm, which is fine. And then let's go ahead and install what we need to work with this, because, like I said, Webpack doesn't really come with any loaders that we can use right off the bat. So we're going to have to get used to installing the loaders that we want to work with. We want to install imports loader and exports loader. And the imports loader is for, not surprisingly, importing additional modules into a badly behaved module, and exports is for exporting things out. And then let's say I want to go ahead and in my index.js, I want to go ahead and require in that badly behaving module. So I want to say var bad module equals require /test bad. And let's go ahead and launch our Webpack server here. So you see it works. But if I went ahead and did a console log bad module, and I hop back over into my page and hit refresh, we see that it's not exporting anything. So just to make this not confusing, I'm going to remove my other console logs out here, so we just have one to look at. And that is going to be this guy right here. So we want our bad module to export whatever it needs to export. In this case, we want it to export that function. So let's go ahead and make it export that function. To do that, we use the exports loader. So we can simply come in here and say exports. And now one of the reasons why I wanted to show this module is to show something we can do with most Webpack loaders, and something you're going to have to really get used to. And that is we can provide query string parameters to them. So I'm going to say use the exports loader and then pass in this following parameter. I want to say exports and then do something and then exclamation point. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying use the exports loader, but then pass in this parameter into it, and then apply this to this module. So the query string parameter is basically how it will look like a normal URL encoded parameter that you'd be used to in an address bar. And it's a great format because we do most of our module loading in strings. But anyway, if I do that and come over here and hit refresh, notice how we're now exporting do something. So now what I can do is I can say bad module and invoke it. Now by invoking it, I come back here and hit refresh. Of course we get an error. Money is not defined because we haven't pulled in jQuery, but at the very least we see that it's working. So what about multiple exports? So if I went to test bad, and let's say I had a function do something else, and then console log, whoa, and then I come back to my index.js, I can simply add an ampersand here and say do something else. Again, that should look very familiar to people used to that sort of syntax in the URL. And of course, this will now throw an error because we're now working with an object. So let's just console log that out. And if I refresh, notice how I get an object with my do something and my do something else methods or functions attached to it. Okay, but we still have that problem. We still need to import jQuery. So how do we do that? Well, we simply tack on a different loader. In this case, the imports loader. So I'm going to say imports followed by the query string, and it's going to be money equals jQuery. And then I'm going to say exclamation point. Again, this is how you separate your loaders with that exclamation point. You can chain as many as you want. Now if I say console log bad module, what did I call that? Do something. And come back here to refresh. Notice how it did indeed work and jQuery was imported. Notice how in addition to all of that stuff, if I open up my build app.js file, we can actually see jQuery right here. jQuery got imported into the bundle. Even though it was never required directly, it was required by our imports. Okay, so again, we run into the issue. This is kind of nasty. We have an issue with having to write all of that code to load in one module. So what I'm going to do here is let's go ahead and bring this into our config. So I'm going to take all of this code, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut it out with Control X. And then I'm going to jump into my config, and I'm going to create another loader. Now for this, I'm simply going to say test is, if it's test-bad.js, and then we end there, then say loader equals, then what I just pasted out of that. So now if I were to refresh, of course I'll get an error because I need to restart my Webpack watch task. But now if I come back here and refresh, I'll still get an error because this is a awesome regular expression and not a string. Be sure not to make that mistake. Now if I come back here, everything is working. So again, make sure that you use a regular expression here and not a string. You could have also used a path, but it will have to be an absolute path. Webpack has this really big thing with absolute paths, but we could also have said path.resolve and then did /src scripts test-bad.js, and that's now an absolute path to that file as a string. So now if I were to restart Webpack here and hit Control or F5, we will indeed see our code working as it did before. Maybe using a absolute path if you're just targeting one script would actually be a better choice to do, or better thing to have done. An alternative way to have done this would be to pass in an array of loaders. So this might be a little cleaner if you have a bunch of loaders. So I can say loaders is imports $money equals jQuery, and then comma, and then pass in exports do something and do something else. So using it this way makes it just a tad bit cleaner, I suppose, if you have a lot of loaders. So if I come over here and restart, we'll see that we got the same behavior as before. But anyway, so that is basically the introduction to loaders with Webpack. And we will see you guys next